Yeah, live. You can start, Emmanuel.
Okay. Okay, so I will start. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us for this seminar on agroecology and agroforestry. So I'm Emmanuel Bourguignon, and I'm going to quickly talk about the Porto Protocol, which is a global movement where like-minded people in the industry gets together in the vineyard viticulture business and trying to share knowledge and information on what can be done to implement regenerative techniques within the vineyards and trying to have a global positive impact on the climate, of course, but also on biodiversity, on the environment, and trying to make the world, I will say, a better place. So without further ado, I'm gonna pass on the speaking to the panel that's here with me, and thanks a lot for joining us. And please join the Porto Protocol. Great initiative. It's lovely to be part of it.
Thank you so much, Emmanuel. I'm Anne. I'm from the Regenerative Viticulture Foundation, and we are absolutely delighted to collaborate with the Porto Protocol on a range of webinars. We are encouraging growers to adopt regenerative practices where relevant, which obviously includes agroforestry or vitiforestry. And I think we found that the last one of these we generated so much interest and so many questions that we wanted to do another one in which we could firstly frame the discussion, but also bring in some different expertise and some different perspectives. I think we all recognise that, as with any regenerative practice, the application varies depending on your ecosystem. So we've got the most amazing panel today. We have the lovely Becky, also from the Regenerative Viticulture Foundation. She's going to frame the discussion for us with an introduction. And then Emmanuel is going to bring his perspective. For those of you who don't know him, he is a soil scientist and wine producer from France. And then we've got Olga, who is a biologist and PhD in ecology from Chile. And then we're going to move on to Katia, who is a producer and viticulturalist from Montalcino. So lots of great perspectives. But the most important thing is that this webinar is not for us, the panelists, it's for you, the attendees. So please do ask lots and lots of questions. The trickier, the better. That's what we're here for. We know that it's, I know the panelists will love me for saying that. We know that it's quite, there's a lot of debate on this topic. So please do open up all of that debate. We've got some great people, and this is a brilliant opportunity to have those conversations. So interact, disagree, ask any questions, and I will weave those into the discussion as we go. So first of all, I'm going to hand over to Becky to frame the webinar with a couple of slides from the RVF. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Yes, I'm Becky, the Programme Director at the RVF. So I've just got two very quick slides here because I think what we want to talk about is why do we think maybe people should consider implementing some form of agroforestry in their vineyards, and what we think that could look like, because there's lots of different aspects to it, different definitions really of what constitutes agroforestry. So what are some of the benefits if you are considering doing it or increasing the degree to which you have trees? I'm not going to read all these different benefits off, but I think some of those, the biodiversity ones, Olga will cover really well, and some of the soil ones and the fungal ones, I think Emmanuel will cover off really well. So there are so many benefits, but as we all know, there are also limitations, and the designs that you might go for are extremely context specific. And so we know there are lots of different designs, and the definition can vary from really just keeping those hedgerows, keeping remnant trees, and protecting the things you already have to some extent, all the way up to some of these very complex and in some cases quite experimental things that we talked about in the last webinar, such as the things at Cheval Blanc, where they're taking out individual vines and replacing them with trees. I know Anne's keen to make sure we cover off all the considerations, so I just want to draw your attention to this bottom line here, which is that we want to think about the ecological considerations, practical ones. So that's where Katia really comes into her own, because she really has that practical experience, and Emmanuel has practical experience across lots of different estates. The economic considerations, and obviously for some people there are quite strong regulatory ones as well. So that's actually all from me. I'm hoping to help answer some of the questions later on, but I'm actually going to pass over to Emmanuel. Thank you.
Thank you, Becky. Sorry, I was just getting my microphone to work again. Okay, so yeah, hi everyone. So Emmanuel, I'm a consultant in soil, in vineyards, of course, but also in other in agriculture in general, but and also for cities, for putting back nutrition within the cities. Anyway, so I work in lots of different fields. When it comes to agroforestry and putting back trees in the system, there is no doubt that trees have been the big loser when it comes to modern agriculture, and including modern viticulture in many areas across the world. We have design blocks that are far too big. So putting back the trees in the system has a lot of beneficial impact. From my expertise from the soil, things as simple as mycorrhizal population within your vineyards. If you have hedgerows or trees within the ecosystem, of course, you increase the ability of your vines to be able to create symbiosis with the mycorrhiza. So that's just one of the example, microbial community, and also the carbon cycle. And some of you might know what can be mentioned also as the liquid carbon cycle, the idea that plants with produce roots exudates, and those roots exudates, the diversity of the roots exudates are directly linked to the species, the biodiversity of the plant species we have in the ecosystem. So if you have a vineyard and with nothing else but vines, for sure, we are missing out on those those exudate diversity, which have an impact on the microbial communities. So having the trees, implementing agroforestry can certainly help in that regard. And without being too long as well, maybe I'll mention one other point will be with managing like soil porosity and water management within the ecosystem at a larger scale, because as soon as you put the trees back into a landscape, especially deciduous trees, they are well known. There's been lots of research done on this to show that how via their evapotranspiration they increase the incidence of rain within throughout the year. So when you are in regions that are already kind of dry, having trees can help bring back some rainfall, or at least try to mitigate the intensity of the rainfalls and make them more useful. And if you have the trees, they will help channel the water further into the ground. So these are some of the really important positive impact, I will say, of having this agroforestry being set up in the vineyard. Now, like Becky said, it's highly dependent on the context and on your situation, on the type of soil you have, the terroir. When we talk about terroir, clearly in agroforestry, terroir comes into play, because you cannot use the same species on like shallow rocky terroir versus deep fertile terroir. I think from my perspective, putting the trees really at the core of the vineyard, within almost the tree rows, the vine rows, is, might be sound if you have a very deep, rich, fertile soil. It might not be so when we are looking at terroirs that are shallow and with a low water holding capacity. And these are some of the topics I might develop later on in this talk to make sure we don't fall into those mistake of agroforestry that can become more of a problem than a solution. And so it's really important that you guys really know the quality of wine you want to produce, because it has an impact on it. The density you're working with in your vineyard, the type of soil, the water holding capacity. You need to put all these things into the equation, and then you can start to design your system. But at the end, the idea is to get definitely more trees in our vineyards. I think I might not, I don't want to be too long. We had this talk yesterday to make sure we don't speak too much. So maybe I pass on the Anne, you can take over. Maybe, I don't know.
Thank you very much, Emmanuel. We can always come back and show some of your pictures later, but perhaps, Becky, do you mind forwarding through to Olga's slides? I'd like to get some of Olga's perspective now. And I think we'll hear from Olga, and then we'll come back to the sort of the practical application of some of these points after that. And so thanks very much. Olga, over to you.
Hey, thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me. Do you see me? Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks for inviting me, and I'm very happy to get to know all the colleagues here. So I want to show a bit of a different perspective of how we take the agroforestry benefits in Chile. So this is a typical vineyard where you can see a lot of native vegetation around. So basically, because our project, I'm sorry, I didn't say, well, I am a scientist working in ecology at this institution at the university, but also it's a research center that is called Institute of Ecology and Biodiversity. And within this institute that is funded by the Chilean government, it's a very long-term research center. We have this project, which is very specific to vineyards. So basically what we do is to make research to understand how all these biodiversity around your vineyard helps, or whether the vineyard also, depends on this nature that we have around. The main difference is that this is native vegetation. It's native vegetation that was there before, and further I'm gonna explain why we're focused on that. But so can we go to the next one, please? So we have seen, this is another vineyard. We have seen that usually when, can you go back to the slides? It's the second one, mine. So we have seen that basically we tend to think that the vineyard is kind of, the neighbor of this native vegetation in this case. Whereas, and it has been thought at that, in that stage all the time. And so we usually say, well, this is the productive land where I have the vineyard, and this is the non-productive land. In my eyes, as an ecologist, I tend to see immediately, the forest, which is something that calls my mind, and then secondary might be the vineyard. So can we go to the next, please, Becky? But the important thing is when we understand that this is a whole property, you see, and this is a whole ecosystem. This is what it's gonna make the system more resilient to climate change, to global change in general, etc. Okay, and why? Because all the processes that are occurring naturally in this vineyard, like what the names that you see here, which are we usually call them ecosystem services, or more recently we tend to talk about like the benefits that people receive from nature. There are several, and all this is science-based, and it's part of the things that we research in this land to understand why we need to protect these pieces of, nature and understand this as a whole. And we have seen the classic climatic regulation, carbon sequestration, natural pest control, a lot of things that we usually know, but we more recently know, as Emmanuel was saying also, that the wild yeasts, for example, that are used to promote, the terroir, which is something that we are trying to, push a lot in Chile. These are shared, and we have papers about it. These are quite shared with the native vegetation. Can we go to the next one? So when we tend to think, we have an issue here in a vineyard, or I want to improve the vineyard, it's very important to understand, again, this is the same photo, to see that there are some features. And all the things that I'm going to show you, so I went from, the functions to ecosystem services, but now I'm going to show you, how you can transform this into practices. And when we get into the practice, we call them nature-based solutions. So these are solutions, for this system, but are based on nature. And why important to be, nature is a solution that has been proved for hundreds of years, because of evolution. So these are very efficient solutions to our problems. So that's why it's very important to understand and how to manage, the forest in this case, or could be the chaparral or our matorral. We call it chaparral, in California. How we need to have biological corridors. Biological corridors need to be connected. If not, they are not biological corridors. The importance of having trees in between, and we have some nice work on seeing how many, if you tend to have these and also tend to have eventually other structures, how important is that for pest control? And if you don't have, these big forests, or this land that you have in your state, you can always, make these vegetation islands. That we call, and when you see that the vineyard, some corners of the vineyard are not very productive, really you will need to consider if it's a better investment to put more vineyard, or if it could be worth having these vegetation corridors. Can you go to the next one? So, and why is this, and I'm going to finish with this, why it's so important for everybody that we are, here in Porto Protocol, and we have discussed this in Porto Protocol, because our 5 Mediterranean areas in the world are biodiversity hotspots. That is a classification, an international classification for priority for conservation. And we cannot do that alone, thinking that the governments are going to take part of it. It's more like the industry, and especially the wine industry that is so charismatic of this area, has a huge opportunity to work on this. And why these areas are so important? Because they are highly diverse, they are highly endemic. It means that the species that we all have in the Mediterranean regions are very unique to those places, and because we have most of the agriculture there has a lot threat. So I just want to finish with this and recall again to mention that viticulture has been a great example for agriculture in general. Only to name, in Chile, we have more than 30,000 hectares in conservation with all these companies. And it's something that it's very, at hand to do. So thank you for giving me the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Olga. Just before I move to Katia, we've had a question in for some more specifics on nature-based pest management, the benefits, but I guess also the challenges. I don't know if, Olga, you've got any more detail you'd like to add on that at this stage?
Well, yeah, we tend to work more with the conservative pest management, basically to increase diversity into the vineyard, okay? More than bringing other insects and all that. And because our focus is on maintaining the diversity, the biodiversity, because, my objective from the beginning has been to work with the viticulture to promote the conservation of biodiversity. we are not, very keen on bringing other species, and especially I'm very, very, careful of never introducing some invasive species, which is something that we all really need to have in our minds, because that is one of the most important threats to biodiversity. So basically, what we do is to modify or increase the heterogeneity of the landscape to encourage encourage a higher diversity into the species community. That's the way we work with it.
Brilliant. Thank you, Olga. And now, Katia, what's your practical experience of actually doing this in real life on your own property? You need to come off mute first.
Here we are. Do you hear me properly?
Yep.
Yeah, now, yeah.
Yes,
Okay,
all good.
Just suddenly felt like it was going zzz, that nobody wanted to hear, the practicalities of Montalcino or something. My name is Katia Nussbaum, and I'm from the winery called San Polino in Montalcino, which is a small town to the south of Tuscany, and it's very famous for the production of its Brunello di Montalcino. And what I've listened to your talks, the two of you talking, and there's so much to unpack already from those conversations. I've written copious notes already. What I wanted, I brought in, okay, start. We're a small family winery, and we've been interested in ecological issues from the very beginning. My husband has an agricultural background because his parents and family were winemakers, and amongst other things they did, agriculturalists, and mine weren't. I came from a different environment, but put together in this situation in Montalcino has been very interesting for us. And right from the start, we were doing ecological farming. And one of the things that has come to, we've joined the Porter Protocol in the last, we've just been with the Porter Protocol for about a year, and it's an absolutely fabulous organization because you're able to discuss your concerns and challenges, not just the things, it's not just for giving yourself a pat on the back, because there's always so many more things to learn. And I'd be interested for you to show the first slide. I've only got one slide because I thought, so this is a map of Montalcino area. Actually, where you see that little red circle is where our house is. So you can see a relatively unforested area, and most of it would have been grain, and the little blobs of trees would have been olives, most likely. And then you see the forests, and a lot of that was pasture land. Then we go forward, and this is where it becomes interesting, to 2002. And these are all forests. So the forests have grown back, and this was to do with policy making from the political entities. It was not just by chance. About 3 years ago, I had the great opportunity to go to the south of France on a wine sort of tour with other journalists. And I found it quite interesting because there was much less tree cover. And I came back to Montalcino to this and almost got colorblinded by the greenery of, the spring in Montalcino in May. And I was speaking to a person who lives just down the road from my little red spot here, who's got a historical winery. And I said to him, it's just our luck. And as Montalcino wine growers, and we should use our luck. And he corrected me. He said, it is not luck. They were political decisions to keep the forests and to work with those forests. And it was just a new way of seeing, put it like that. And I like these things. Now, So if we go the next slide, this is 2016, and we see more or less the same sort of thing, but these are aerial photos now in the color version. So how do we handle this situation? Okay, so we're doing what, is quite frankly, making a vineyard is not by itself sustainable. It's not an automatically sustainable action, because you're going in there with your tractors and you're tearing out stuff that was living quite happily. Thank you very much. All the insects, birds, lizards, you have it, and you're making your vineyard. And so that's one big weight on the equation of non-sustainability or non-regenerativeness. And but what we decided to do right from the start was to keep the maintained have a lot of areas of maintained wilderness. I have to say that in the Montalcino area comprises 23,000 hectares, of which only 1/3 is vineyarded. Something like 15,000 is vineyard. Then we've got something like, I don't know, another small proportion is olive grove, then you've got pasture land, then you've got Mediterranean shrubland, and about 75% forest land, at least. I don't know the exact, I saw them and I don't remember numbers so well, but it's something like that. So you've got this enormous potential of keeping these ecological corridors and, your ecology. So just to cut it short, first of all, we kept a lot of wilderness. However, in about 2016, from when this photograph was taken, I got very interested in the idea of tree communication. The German book came out, what was it? The Private Life of Trees, or whatever it was. And I thought, damn, but are vines are trees? Are they able to communicate? So I got into the whole story of suddenly understood something about soil ecology, about the biome of the soil. And I understood that the forests are not the same, that they're not necessarily commensurable underneath the soil in terms of their connections with the vines, because they're working on different networks. Their fungal networks are different. And many times I came onto webinars and I would ask people, could it be that the forest is communicating, the forest biome, subsoil, is communicating with the vines? And sometimes I got a yes, sometimes I got a no, and ultimately it turned out that it was a don't know. So what to do? We started planting trees in the vineyard in 2018. We made a vineyard. You can't see it now because this was, prior to the planting of this vineyard. And at the heads of the rows and all around, we planted fruit trees, and at the heads, apricot trees. Well, it's a beautiful vineyard. Is that data? That's not really data. It's observable, but it might have been great had we not planted the trees. In 2022, one of the fields that you can see there, I should have indicated it, I didn't, it doesn't matter really. We took out, because there was a lot of troubles we had some troubles with the vines, we had a lot of escas, and also it hadn't been planted very well. We wanted to change for helping with climate mitigation. We wanted to change the line of the rows in accordance to where the sun falls at midday or 1 o'clock, the hot moment of the day. And at that point, we said, okay, let's plant trees inside those vines. And we chose maples. And we chose maples to plant because they flower and they attract insects. Their roots go quite deep, so they don't disturb, you don't disturb them when the tractor passes by. They have a historical significance. They were used in the Etruscan times. They were used for supporting vines. They were used in the same way in the Roman times. They were used in the medieval times, and right up to before the war. They were called married. They were married vines. The vines grew up the trees, and they were called the maple trees, and they were called married. It's rather beautiful notion. So we have yet to see. We'll find out, won't we? We don't know now. I know the maples are happy. We'll find out if the vines are happy as time goes by. There's for me, there's a metaphorical angle to this. I like the, the idea of, it's like you had you had industrial farming that had moved in to, modern times industrial farming. And we glance back over our shoulders and we look at how people did it in the past. People did many things in the past. They used leeches to bleed you in the past. It doesn't mean that the past was always perfect. But trees seem to be something that's a nice thing to plant, supported now by the science. And it's also, for me, a great metaphor of this interconnected world. And which is something I'd like to talk about later, but it's not for the talk right now. We have the scientific aspects with the data that connects to it, but also it's almost like a piece of concept art that's talking about climate change, and that climate change has been provoked by the agriculture that we're trying now to remedy. So it's kind of complex, but anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you, Katia. That's brilliant. And it's kind of complex could probably be the subtitle of any webinar on agroforestry. I love your question and that concept of the interconnectivity of different fungal networks from different species. And I think probably if there's anyone that can answer that and has got the background to do that, and also the experience of that in different ecosystems, it's Emmanuel. So Emmanuel, have you got anything that you'd like to add on that?
Yeah, for sure. Even from a evolutionary point of view, the answer you were looking for, Katia, I mean, yes, there's no doubt the vines and the trees do communicate. From an evolutionary point of view, the vines, whether they are the American cultivars or the Vitis vinifera, which initially was Vitis sylvestris before it got domesticated. These plants are vines, and they coexist with the trees. They need the trees to be able to go high up in the canopy, and that's where, from an evolutionary point of view, they were designed to live like. So in terms of their communication, root system ability to communicate with the trees, to me there's no debate there, because that's it's just the history of their evolution. Of course, once we get vineyards where the trees are spatially separated quite far away from the vines, it becomes more difficult to have this connection between the vines and the trees. Like you mentioned, Katia, you point out that we have a lot in the old world anyway. Vines have been cultivated, they've been domesticated a long time ago, and they've been cultivated for many millennium now, and we have a lot of archives or drawings showing that vines were cultivated with the trees and so on. So to me, combining the two is definitely something that can make sense, but you have to also take into consideration the quality of the wine you're gonna make behind, and the terroir. What struck me when I started to do some research on viticulture in the past, how it was done, especially in France or in Italy, Spain. When you look at what's written in the 17th century, 18th century, 19th century, it is well documented. I will take the example of France because I come from France, but Italy, we had some specialists coming on to some Porto protocol before talking about this. We know that vines, you can either grow it. Vines, they will grow up trees. They will behave like vines. That's their if they could choose, that's what they will do. But they will also they can be rampant. vines are perfectly capable to live and crawling on the ground. You have a lot of nurseries where the rootstocks are grown that way, just ramping, crawling on the land. They can be pruned and grow at a relatively small height, and you can also grow it where spaced in between trees, but having several vines between the trees. So there's many ways of growing the vines. What struck me is that the more you are in the around, let's say, the Mediterranean region, the more there are the documents on combining the vines and the trees are quite abundant, and they've persisted until quite recent times. And the more you look into the more northern vineyards with higher density of plantation, the more you see that the tree, when the agronomists of the time talk about wine quality and how the vineyard should be managed, the more you see that the tree is not taken out of the system, of course not, but it's not growing with the vines, it's growing as hedges around the vineyards. And I found that really interesting because they all mention, when I crisscross the information, the bibliography I could find with guys like in France, we had Olivier Dessert, which was a very famous, Olivier Guyot, who did a very exhaustive inventory of all the viticulture practices across all the regions of France. And they all come up with the same observation, which is usually in France, we grow vines in the slightly northern vineyards. When vines are combined with trees, it's usually for the peasant wine. It's the wine of every day. It's not a wine that is destined for exportation and for commercialization. And when they talk about the top end wine, the highly high quality wine, they say the trees shouldn't be close to the vines because it decreases the quality of the wine. And then when you go further south, you almost get the reverse observation, where they say that the tree brings with its foliage and with the shadow help compensate excess heat and is a good combination with the vines. And so I think we should, of course, what's happening now is not what it was in the 17th centuries or 18th centuries, but what this tells me is that already at that time, people had a quite acute understanding of how vine and trees cohabitate and what impact it has on the wine quality. And at the end of the day, we are still making wine. And I think it is really important to know what kind of, if your wines, I know in Burgundy, for example, there are clearly limitations of putting the trees right in the middle of the blocks. Yet at the same time, I'm saddened when I go to places like Chablis and I see huge wine plots where you have no edges, the forest areas are very far away, and you end up with almost like a monoculture of vines, and the ecosystem loses its resilience. You have more erosion problem in the steep slopes and so on. And I think it's important to keep the trees when you are on those type of vineyards anyway, to think of it more as a way of reducing the size of the plots so that for the biodiversity, for the bats and all that, they can better circulate within the ecosystem because they have smaller plot to navigate through, and they have all those hedges and trees on the edges that are growing that they can either shelter. Just to bounce back to one of the questions that was asked earlier, we know, for example, that some of the wasp that will parasitize some of the caterpillars that will attack the bunches, they need trees to hibernate and to take refuge. And if you don't have the trees, you can inoculate maybe the parasitoids, but they won't survive because they have no habitat for them. So that's, I've said a lot of things, but I find it sometimes, it annoys me that sometimes agroforestry in viticulture is presented only with all the ecological impact, but without putting into the context of the wine quality we are producing and the density of the fields, of the vines and all that. And that's something that we need to be really careful with.
So Emmanuel, I wanted to follow up on something there. You talked a lot about smaller plots and the quality of the wine. Equally, I can see a lot of producers from around the world, particularly from someone from the New World, and a lot of questions we've previously had have been around the economic productivity. So have you got anything to add on the productivity?
Can you put up my slides? Just put up my vineyard, Becky, if you could. That would be absolutely great. I think it's, if I'm not mistaken, it's picture number 4. If you could put up the picture number 4, not this one, the next one. The next one, yes. Thank you very much. This is an overview of the vineyard we have in France, in the southwest region of France. And is the picture up? Yeah? No. Anyway, and what we did when we set up this vineyard, the idea there was to reclaim those slopes that were cultivated with vines, it was covered with vines until the phylloxera, then it was abandoned. It's 35% slopes. And when we started to remove the forest because it had been overgrown, we need to make space for the vines again. But what we did is every time we as you see on the picture, we kept all the lines you see were originally the small stone walls that were separating the fields, and on those stone walls that have been totally collapsed, we had a lot of natural hedges that grew up, and we kept them. We said, no, we're not going to erase these. And when you see this vineyard, the way it's done is that I can do like any mechanical work in this vineyard, going up and down without. I never need to do a turnaround or anything. I go from one row to the other, and I just jump over the edge, and then I carry on. And some of these blocks, the number of rows is 18 to 20 rows, and then you have the edge. And from a practical and economical point of view, the only cost this generates for us will be the pruning we do so that the hedges don't overgrow the vines, because there are some limitations despite all the things we do. If you go to the pictures, the picture that's up from this, pictures number 3, we've kept space. We've increased initially the edges were closer to the vines, and we now remove some rows of vines to increase the space for the edges because we were getting too much competition on the vines. And now strategically I try to play with other rootstock, like extremely vigorous rootstock right next to the edges. And these rootstocks are not necessarily the best one for the quality of my wine or of the grapes, but further into the block, I go with other rootstock, and we keep more space because despite if you manage the root system of the edges, you get water competition in those systems. But the other thing I can say is that overall, the benefit, and the final slide I have that can be interesting for people is that we have very steep slopes, and when it rains, we can. This picture on the right, we had 67 millimeters of rain in about 2 hours and a half, and that was just a few days before harvest. And you can see the one of these edge that we've kept that, well, this one was planted, that we actually planted it. I planted those trees. The beauty of it is that in the pathway, the road, we had erosion because the water could like run along the road, but on the vineyard we had no erosion, and the edge really played this role of channeling and protecting that water coming from the path. Instead of that water getting into the vineyard and creating havoc in the soil, it acted as a filter. So altogether, the way we designed this, I will say the edges and the trees in the system are really, they don't have a negative economic impact. But initially, we had some edges where the vines were way too close, and we ended up having problem with the rows that were adjacent next to those edges, and we had to take some more space. That's what you see on this picture. But we haven't resorted to put the trees within the vineyard, because all the oak trees we've kept because they were beautiful trees and we didn't want to remove them, and we planted our vines around them. with a lot of spacing, we're still like 15 to 20 meters away from these trees. We have some decrease in vigor of the vines. It's very, very easy to identify, and that's because root competition. You can't.
Thank you. I am going to go to Katia in a second, but first, Emmanuel, I've got one question, and you're allowed a one-word answer on this one, or maybe a two-word answer. What rootstock are you using next to the trees? Do you have a specific preference? You could have a couple of words.
Yeah. Well, it depends on my site here. I've been doing trials with 140 Ruggieri and getting very, very good results.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We're going to stop there. Katie, if you've got a follow-up on that, pop it into the Q&A and we'll come back to it if we've got time at the end. Katia, how does what Emmanuel has been saying chime with your experience?
I don't know if I agree with everything that he says. I mean, it's not a question of agreeing or not. It's like facts are facts. You don't argue with facts. But but it's a supposition because first of all, I wouldn't. The idea of having that you say that quality wine isn't grown on trees. When they're grown, I don't think that anybody's claiming to do that. First of all, right in the beginning of this, when our story with Vitiforestry first began, we were thinking, well, let's take the vines into the forests. Let's see what happens if we plant them in the forests. What fun. And then obviously we're not allowed to because of regulation. So that's when we thought, this was even before I knew about Vitiforestry, before I knew about regenerative agriculture, said, okay, we'll bring the forest into the field. And I mean, what to say? I can't, I don't know. I mean, I don't know if the sommeliers have tasted all the wines which come from vines near forests. In Montalcino, every vineyard is near forests. I don't know about too much about gaps between the forest and the vine rows. Obviously, you have the same you have space for the tractor if you're working with a tractor. But the vines, no, it's true that they don't like the oak trees, right? They don't like the oak trees, but the idea is that do they like other trees? And the idea of the maples wouldn't be to keep them, at least this is my idea. You were talking about before about designing your vineyard around, with the vitiforestry. Well, I'm born in a different way, I suppose. I don't do much designing in my world, in a sense. Obviously, design how you want the vineyard to be and so on like that. But in this case, I've just planted vineyards at what seems to be maples at 15-meter distances over in a hectare a bit less than a hectare we've started with. The maples that are inside the vineyards. And my idea has been to grow them up so that the foliage, I don't know what you call it, the top of the tree is above the vines, because maples can grow quite nice and high. So they'd just be like poles, and then we'd use them for shade. It would be just interesting to see what happens as a shade. I mean, obviously, we're not going back to kind of medieval farming practices, because unfortunately, we're in the modern world and we've got to make a business of this. So the idea will just be for shade, biodiversity, and see what happens. And guess what? Worst comes to the worst. I'll be burning them on the fire in the next
Katia,
10 years.
If I can just say something, for example, trees, like growing vines with maple trees and getting them quite high up, getting the canopy of the vines higher up from the ground. Not
the vines, the tree.
No.
The vines will be the same. Oh, okay, yeah. Sorry.
Just want to add that among the practices that have been done and that were really positive on the vines and on the production was, for example, on all the terroirs that are naturally exposed to spring frost, to frost in general. One of the solution viticulturists have implemented in the past was combining the trees in the vineyard to help to have vines with higher canopy, because they will use the trees. to get their foliage higher up. And by doing so, they remove the vine, they get the vines further away from the soil, and you reduce the risk of having frostbites either on your buds, or if it's closer to flowering, and so I think having the trees within the vineyard and having the vines using the trees, there are many cases where it will guarantee you a better production than if you don't. But
We'll find out.
I also, yeah.
I want to go back to Olga now. I'm going to go back to Olga. I think because she's itching to speak on that topic, and then I also want to ask her a specific question that's in the Q&A as well. But Olga, back to you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think well, first of all, as some has stated there in the questions and comments, we are talking slightly, there's a difference between having the vine in the tree, over the tree, and having, trees around certain distances, etc. However, I think that this discussion that Katia and Emmanuel began shows very interestingly that there is no research enough to demonstrate, if these kind of practices make better wine, basically. Not only because we already know, and it has been very much proven in agriculture, all of the benefits. It has been proved in wheat, in cacao, and and coffee, etc. Many other productive agriculture elements that are that has been tested. However, I think that in this case, wine is very particular because it has this concept of quality and terroir, that it's about something that you taste, really. No, I'm not saying that it's not necessarily very objective, but it's very complex to gauge it and then prove it. So my issue here, my point is that we really need to understand which are the effects on the final product, which is the wine, and think also it's something about perception. When we know that a wine got the first place in whatever, we don't necessarily see the whole surrounding of the state. So it's difficult for me to see if that great wine comes generally from a state that has a huge diversity in the landscape. So I think it's like a homework, or something that we really need to think about, because we don't want the experience that occurred many years ago when organic wine began to be on the tables, that people tend to say, no, this is not very good wine. At the beginning, no, we know now that there are great, beautiful organic wines, and I think it's because it will depend on the quality of the wine, but we need to be systematic and methodic on really researching about this stuff, and I think this is a great opportunity to talk about this, and then maybe set up a research on it.
Thank you, Olga. There's a question here from David that's specifically viticulture, but I wonder if you might have a broader perspective from other agriculture as to whether there are any good studies that highlight how planting trees and interplanting trees can mitigate or indeed potentially increase the risk of different diseases and disease pressure.
There are several, and this is what it makes it so complex, that you have different cases. It will depend a lot on the landscape. For example, if you have a very degraded landscape, usually even having trees or very few species, it becomes kind of a risk, because the landscape already is, for example, with birds. We love birds. But if you have a degraded, landscape, and then birds see that the resource is fruit, of course they are gonna go and eat the fruit in the vineyard. But we have seen that, and there are studies about it, that when the landscape is healthy, that occurs less. We have some data that show, for example, that the blocks that are near, so we had a very high, we had a year with a lot of botrytis, several harvests again, but huge amount of, of these issues. And we could measure, that botrytis was lower in blocks that were near the forest. And that is part of the ecology theory, which we have proven with a lot of other species, that the disease dilutes in the diversity of hosts.
Thank you so much, Olga. That's super
part of
helpful. Emmanuel, if you've got anything to add on that topic on ESCA in particular, I think people would be interested. But also, both Fred and Kane would like to know, and that you can tell this is the practical viticulturalist asking, is there a list of specific species of tree and what benefits they have, whether they have a particular, whether natives or fruit trees, a combination of those, or equally if there's a list of species that sort of perfectly suit different viticultural situations?
Okay, first of all, the going back to what Olga said earlier on, which was super important, especially when you are in Mediterranean region, is try to work as much as possible with your native flora. That's to me, that's the first thing you have to list is what are the plants that have the, let's say, the highest environmental value, either because they host some rare insects. It is really important to take that in mind, because it's part of the global solution, giving chance to some of those rarer species to be able to thrive again. So that's the first point. Then once you have that in mind, try to privilege trees that could be called white wooded trees. What I mean by that is maple tree is a really good example, elm trees, but things like oak trees, yew, these trees are not so well, they're not best suited to be next to the vines. But anything like white trees that can also accept regular pruning, because once you start to, if you do Vigna maritata, like married vines with trees, again, when you go back to the old practices and what was implemented, you realize that it was often a highly managed system in which the trees are pruned. And some trees accept pruning better than others. And generally speaking, trees with what I'll say a white wood, trees that usually grow relatively fast, are trees that can tolerate that type of pruning. And yeah, so, and they also often have a flowering that is very, very interesting for the environment. That's some of the thing I could that people can keep in mind. And if you are going to that, you have like the big trees, like ones that can go, grow over 20 meters and so on. And then if you go more like edges that you want, because you are in a region where sun might be a limiting factor, then edges might be more your solution. And then you need to work with bushes that again tolerate the pruning, so that you can manage their canopy, and by doing so, you will not have a negative. I mean, I can see from my personal experience that in the winter, when I go along all my edges in my vineyard, which are pruned during during the winter, they are full of bird nest, and they're full of praying mantis during the growing season. I get like a lot of insect predators in this area. We get partridge. We get it's amazing in terms of biodiversity. They get really dense because we prune them. They get really dense, and they are an amazing refuge for reptiles. We get a lot of snakes, big lizards, and to me that's a big positive for the vineyard.
Amazing, thank you so much. There was one other question just around the relationship between the sort of the square meterage of vines to trees, and is there a sort of optimal balance?
number of trees versus vines.
Yeah. Well, the question was actually over on meterage, but I guess number of trees to vines would give a good idea.
Yeah. The trick with this question is that you really need to look into the water holding capacity of your terroir. It's really important that you understand how deep is the bedrock, what is the volume of soil your vines have access to, what are the, and it will be different if you talk for a new plantation versus a vineyard that is already established. On an already established vineyard, you need to assess the depth of the root system of your vines. You need to know the rootstock and the water, like I said, the water holding capacity. And depending on this, you can be more or less, the density of trees can be very low or higher. I might take a bit too much time to get hold of this information, but I had come across some info saying it was more like down to, depending on how southern the vineyard was, I had like data on the vine density and how many trees you could place within these vineyards, but it's going to take me.
Emmanuel, I know. I think people will be really fascinated in that. But if you can dig that out afterwards, we'll send it out along with the recording link, which would be amazing.
Absolutely.
We are now reaching time. We can carry on for a few more minutes. I'd like to just come back to each one of the panelists. Although I have just seen Marcus's comment, which I think is lovely. Are there any specific tree species that help build up a soil microbiome that's particularly beneficial for vines? Do any of the panelists have any?
Diversity. It's not about like one tree, or it's diversity of trees. You need to get as many species as you can. Of course, like I said, there are certain species that are not, like all the apple trees and so on. We know that they can stimulate armillaria millera, like the oak tree. To me, it's not about focusing on one species. Get as many species, and again, from experience that I've seen, and from Vitinov has been working on this, the minimum is like you need to minimum 20 species of trees in your system. You can't go below that. You really need to get the diversity in. That's what drives the diversity of your microbial community within the soil. The more plants you get, the more you're gonna get a diverse microbial community.
I agree with Emmanuel. I just want to add, and in general, there is research that show that if you want a healthy production in agriculture, you should have at least 20% of that would be the optimal of having 20% of vegetation inside your farm.
Amazing. Thank you. I'm going to come back to Katia now. Katia, is there anything that you want to cover that we've not yet talked about?
Tons, but it doesn't matter because there's always so much more. But there's just two things. There's a couple of things. It's just that I'd like to get back to just asking Emmanuel one thing, and then how the whole thing seems to me listening to this conversation. First of all, but we're going to put this on the back burner for the moment. He's talking about whitewood trees. I'm just wondering whether, are you meaning ones which are like in terms of, are you talking about their mycorrhizal relationships, like that because the oak trees can't be planted in the vineyards because they're ectomycorrhizal and maples are endomycorrhizal? Well, that's why we chose them, and I suppose that inadvertently that's why they were used in the past. This is just a question. Then I want to jump onto something else, and listening to all this, it just seems to me is that I felt that we're kind of talking about this dichotomy between the quality of the product and the quality of the environment. Okay, but I wonder why we've fallen into this, because I wonder to what extent why it's a balance, why you can't have both, why you can't have a wonderful environment and a wonderful quality. And there's just one last thing that I wanted to say, and then I'm silent silent forever, I will be silent, is that I was telling Becky before that some weeks ago or some months ago, I saw this article in The Guardian, and it said something, it was about something really mean about people talking about trees and forests communicating, and it said, oh, socialist forests, is it a fantasy? Do trees really communicate? And I just thought, whoa, well, maybe they don't, but maybe they do, because I'm not a scientist, but a lot of my time I spend reading about science, and I've looked at the work that you've been doing, Emmanuel, in a very innocent, non-scientific way, but I've been working in this world for 30 years. I've looked at all sorts of things. I've read books. I've done a whole load of stuff. And I can't understand why. I think it says more about the times in which we live that want to sort of dismiss the idea that trees and nature can communicate on ways that we don't know about, than it says about actually about nature, which is not saying anything, it's just doing its thing, so to speak. And as a last thing, I'd been telling Becky, it reminded me of the story of The Life of Pi, if any of you are familiar with that book. And he has these whole masses of adventures on his trip around the world on this boat. And in the end, the journalists who are talking with him say to him, but you had a horrible time, let's face it, all that you said, it's just fantasy. You had a horrible time, your mother was killed, your baby brother died miserably, everybody was miserable. And Pi replied, well, come on, which story do you prefer? And I feel it's a bit like this. It's like we've got to look at the possibilities, not look at the negatives, because there's enough of those crushing us at the moment. And so the only bad thing about planting trees in vineyards is that you work out that you made a mistake, and then you can cut them down. It's not so terrible. And anyway, look, we'll drink together. In 10 years' time, we'll drink a glass of wine that came from the tree around my maples.
We will. But what I'm not going to do is finish the webinar on we can cut them down. So before that, I'm going to go back to a lovely comment about, well, equally not as jolly. I promise we'll end on a high. But before we do, has anyone got anything to add on? I'm looking probably particularly at Emmanuel on this, and then I want to go back to Olga before we finish. But Emmanuel, there's a question about fire prevention and whether trees are, again, a help or a hindrance on that, and how that we can bring consideration in dry regions for fire prevention. Have you got any experience particularly in that space?
Without question, when you get again, I will go more on specify deciduous trees with some of the coniferous trees. The question might be different, but if I look at in France, when you have deciduous trees in the system, because of the type of organic matter they will produce on the soil, they will increase actually the water holding capacity of the soil. And when I was talking about trees with more like a white wood, it's also because these trees, as soon as you prune them, because the carbon resource within our ecosystem are becoming more and more important. If you have trees in the system, let's not forget that when agroforestry was implemented a long time ago, it's not a silver bullet that is a new invention. Farmers and viticultures have been doing this for a long time. And when you read about it, trees are also seen as a carbon resource in the system, either to make compost or to give fodder to animals, or biochar, yeah, all sorts. So and in that respect, some trees can produce more biomass than others, and that's why I mention more these trees. And yeah, going back to fire prevention, I will, from a soil point of view, I can just tell you that you have many of the deciduous trees in my case, like in France, that when they are here and you have a nice forest litter develop, you have, because you increase the population of especially basidiomycetes. Basidiomycetes tend to have these amazing abilities that in their hyphae, they will have like proteins called aquaporins, And these aquaporins are a system that helps them hold water. So if you increase your carbon content in the soil, and especially a humus that is derived from trees more than from grassland, you will increase basidiomycetes population and ascomycetes population as well. And then you will increase these kind of aquaporins in the system. So you increase the amount of water that's held. And then when you get like fire hazard condition, if you have a forest floor that holds more water, it will be less flammable than if it's not the case. So there are many, I could digress, and there's many other, but if I was to give one and try to be short, that's what I'd say.
Amazing. Thank you. So we've had the most brilliant perspective here from such a broad range of panelists. I'm actually going to give the last word to Olga. I'm going to ask her to tread the line between the philosophy and the science, and ask you the final question is, do trees talk to vines? Olga.
I don't think so. I don't think that. I think that they communicate in some. For me, it's not kind of a new thing, because nature is all related, and we know that, there are these interconnections. There are signals, like exudates and things like that. So I think the important thing is to understand it is connected. So trees, or whatever you do to the trees or the vines, or the fungi or microbes that we don't see, have an impact. And we should be measuring when those impacts are significant or not, and, until which threshold things still work. So we should be, I think we all came here from different perspectives, and we're pretty clear that we need to have diverse systems. And that's the most important thing. We all agree, and that's great.
We do all agree, and the word interconnectivity is, I think, been the word of the day, between the people, the trees, the vines, the biome, and everything else that supports both quality of the vine, the wine, and the ecosystem. And on that note, we're going to finish for today. So thank you so much to the panelists. It's been a really interesting webinar, and thank you for the audience for the most incredible questions. Thank you very much. I hope you've all learned something. I certainly have.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Oh, that was
So,
nice.
Thanks,
that was
team.
Thank you, guys. Thank you very much.
Really nice to meet you
Great
all.
to-
Olga. So
Sorry.
interesting. Emmanuel, so interesting. Really,
it
really
was
Yeah.
very good. And it was so good that you were not all in agreement.
That's part of the diversity, you see.
Yeah,
Yes,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
We're still live on YouTube, by the way. I'm just
We're
going to
still
point that
live.
out to everybody.
It's okay,
We're still live.
I'll have to cut it. Don't worry about it.
Okay,
I'll
fine.
cut it, so don't worry. So we're
We're
not
still-
saying anything that is
We've
Okay.
still got 20.
Contentious.
Indeed.
yeah, exactly. We still have people here.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. I'm going to have to go anyway, because I need to go and pick my
I have
daughter
to
up
go
from
too.
nursery.
Yeah.
Bye.
All right. Thank you all.
Thank you all so
everyone.
much.
Bye-bye,
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks.